Dan was normally down for his lunch at 1 prompt, but thanks to Greg in office management, who apparently couldn't tell the difference between staplers and paper clips, it was now after 3, and he was starving. He pushed open the door of the staff canteen with his foot and walked into a room that he'd never seen so empty. As he slid a plastic salver across the tray rail, he peered into the steaming bain-maries, all empty save for smears of what once they'd held. Obesity! Dan looked round. Well, yeah, I mean, he knew he could stand to lose a few pounds, but anonymous shouting was a bit much. It had been a woman's voice, but from where he knew not. Sobriety! There it was again. Dan jumped, dropped his plate. The sound of clattering ceramic was sufficiently alarming that a woman in an apron appeared. "You OK?" she asked. "Yeah," said Dan, just a bit startled. Someone shouted. "Oh, yeah, right. That was me, sorry. I've got a countdown on in the office. At my house, you had to shout out the words as you got them, or no one believes you." "Tracy," she replied, sticking out her hand. "No," he replied, "it's Dan." "No, I mean, my name's Tracy," she countered. "I know. Sorry, it was meant to be a joke." "Oh, yeah, right, of course, sorry." She smiled. So did Dan. "If you don't want to sit on your own," Tracy continued, "you can sit in the office with me. But shush, countdown's on." And so it began. From then on, Dan took his lunch break at 3:15 and shouted words at a screen with the loveliest girl in the world. A year later, Tracy was a bit sad. Stood in the queue on her own, she was wishing Dan was with her. She'd been thrilled when he told her that he'd got them both tickets to see Countdown being recorded, and they'd bought the train tickets to Salford together, but then something at work had come up and now she was here on her own. It'd be fun, but not as fun as if Dan was here. She took her seat and put her coat on the empty one beside her. Daft, but she missed him. The studio lights dimmed and out came Nick, Susie, Rachel and some bloke with a beard she'd never heard of. And the contestants. The contestants were a quantity surveyor from Guildford and Dan. As Dan took his seat, he looked nervous. Tracy's heart was in her chest too, if for no other reason than she nearly always beat Dan when they played together, and this quantity surveyor had Octo Champ written all over him. Tracy was stunned, so stunned, in fact, that the top of the show was a blur. By the time she snapped out of it, Dan was asking for his first set of letters. Tracy's mind started whirring. The dashing Nick Hewer turned to Dan. "What have you got, Dan?" he asked. 8, Dan replied, and the crowd oohed. Ooh. Before he'd had time to say what the word was, though, Rachel began shifting the letters. But she was in the way. Tracy couldn't see what she was doing. And if that wasn't enough, Dan had stood up. He'd actually stood up in the middle of a game of Countdown. Unheard of. He was making his way over to Tracy. Tracy looked at Dan and back at the board, and Rachel now stood to one side. When she looked back at Dan, he was down on one knee, a ring in his hand and hope in his eyes. An expectant hush fell over the studio. And that was the day a 3-letter word won Countdown.
Brilliant. Oh, so good. So good. Very good. Romantic. It's talent.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm very glad you enjoyed it.
No, very much. There.